just to welcome you guys to this talk, and this is part of a series of Technovation talks. And why do we do that? Because new technology is coming out every month, every week, but it also only becomes useful if you apply it somewhere, if you combine it with domain knowledge, and then come up with ideas, and that's what innovation is. This is open to any staff, technical, non-technical, and we'd love to work with you. If afterwards you come up with ideas, come to us and we can help you brainstorm and maybe get to a prototype or something. All the talks are focused on emerging technologies or innovation, and that's actually what today's talk is about innovation. There's other talks coming up that you can see on our website on crowdsourcing, gamification, human behavior, predicting human behavior through online conversations, Bitcoin, blockchain. And today, we're very happy to have David Clark here. And usually I remember the title of the person who's speaking, but David has so many titles. I need
Jack of all trades and master of none.
Yeah, in fact we were gonna invite Elon Musk today, but then we realized David has a much more impressive CV, so forget Elon. Dean of Strategic Initiatives, well, I'm not going to read all of these, but he's doing a lot of great things at Columbia, very active, and he's also an entrepreneur. He has had 4 companies, and he's had a degree in aerospace engineering and in political science, which I think is a wonderful to combine this technology knowledge with other knowledge. So I won't say much more. I'll give the floor to David.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much. Great, thank you. So everyone I think saw the talk from the invitation, so thank everyone for coming. And you can actually jump in any time if I'm not clear, so feel free to jump in and ask any questions. So I think everyone knows the title. So I actually start off with, it was my first year of graduate school. This is the first class. I walk in, and this professor, who I thought was my professor, says, every great graduate student should be this. And I'm thinking, wait, I'm a PhD in political science. Did I go into the wrong class? Am I in art history? And what he really was talking about, I actually found out that I was in the right class. And what he was really getting at is you should really think sort of in a multi-perspective way. Think about the different ways that you approach a problem, a solution, and it's not really a singular way. So it really is a multiple perspective of things, and that's something that has really kind of struck with me as I've been kind of thinking about the way I think about things, and if there are sort of certain touch points about the way I think, it really gets to the first thing, which is I'm an immigrant. I came to this country when I was young, so there's this notion of both being part of a place and not really belonging to a place. And that, again, is something that has been very formative for me as I approach things, try to build empathy. The other thing is, actually, I'm a rocket scientist. So I got my undergraduate degree as an aerospace engineer. And there's something about actually being an engineer that's also very unique, the way you think and approach a problem. And it really is about problem solving. I have all the technical skills. If I figure out the process, I can really solve it. So I appreciate that sort of engineering way of looking at things. The other really, I think, formative part for me was actually then spent some time being an exhibition aide at the National Gallery of Art. So this is the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art down in Washington, D.C. And thinking about creativity, just going into work every day and seeing a Rothko, a Jasper Johns, and seeing the processes that they went through to create something like that was terrific. So for 2 years I got to literally immerse myself in sort of the artistic world, which is terrific. And then I decided to do something a little bit more radical and get my PhD in political science. So this is Columbia University. So it's definitely on the social science side, but it's also very much coupled with the very quantitative side. So it's very much a sort of a quantitative social scientist. But again, thinking about what a social scientist approaches a problem, it really is trying to look at the underlying mechanism that generates something. Actually, I also lead a master's program in global thought, and I remember a student was asking me, well, what's the difference between kind of a humanities person, a social science person, and a public policy person. And the way that I kind of look at it is, for a humanities sort of a historian, they look at a problem, they say, for me to get one moment in time right, to figure out all the pieces and get that as an accurate representation of that day, like that's hard enough. My humility stops there, and I'm not going to go any further. And the social scientist then comes in and says, well, that's great, and we actually rely on a lot of historians, but we actually want to then understand, well, what produced that day? Because there could have been 50,000 different iterations of that day that could have appeared, but what produced that day, and what was the underlying mechanism? And then I think the public policy person says, well, that's great, but we actually then want to have some sort of prescriptive way of looking at things. So again, I think being a social scientist, but being immersed definitely in a PhD program, got me to think about a lot of different things. And then I did one more kind of radical thing. I decided to leave my academic career and start a tech company. So the first company I started was back in 1999, Internet 1.0, and I still advise a lot of startups. And I tell them, back then we had to use things called T1 line. What's that? We had to crimp our own Ethernet cables. There was no Wi-Fi. But it was, again, it's a great experience if you just take a raw idea, have no money, no resources, and build a team and build something where someone is using it. And the first one was a great learning experience. It was probably the most painful experience because it went belly up. But the second one, I think, did a little bit better. And then I did a third and fourth one. So, when I think about my sort of way of thinking, my sort of style of thinking, it really is a combination of all these different things. And it's, sort of a question that I ask you, what is your style of thinking? It's funny because we talk about, what's your style of food, what's your style of clothing. I think people rattle that off very easily, but when I ask people, like, what is your style of thinking? Because the way that you make decisions is based on your style of thinking. It's a much harder question. So again, it's just something for you to think about. What is your style? What are the different experiences that you've had to produce your style of thinking? So for me, it's a little bit of a jumbled term. So I like to say my style of thinking is historical, institutional, comparative, entrepreneurial, ecologist. And there are ways that, literally, when I look at problems, I literally do try to check off these things. So one, I want to try to embed whatever I'm looking at within the historical context. And, I think a historian said, historians sort of, they do what they call sort of violence to time. Whenever we say we want to bookend and we want to look at a particular period, it really is sort of this exogenous way we're looking at it. And it really is this sort of continuous flow. So I always try to look at things historically. And again, I think institutions play an important role. It's not just behavior in humans that are generating their institutional things. And then again, I always want to do something comparative. Look at not just here, but across different regions, different areas. And then there's a sort of entrepreneurial way of looking at things. Well, I'll go into more detail. And then the last thing which I really realized is all of this stuff is very much interconnected. So taking more of an ecology approach as opposed to, and I have a lot of friends in physics, and I love physics, and we have a lot of physics envy in a lot of the social sciences, but I don't think actually physics is sometimes the best. It's more on the biology, ecology side. So this is the way, if you had to ask me what my style of thinking, that's how I would approach it. So kind of looking at this broader question around ecosystems and innovation, I'm going to try to roughly use this template. So if we sort of imagine what the future cities could look like, I think it's important to look at it historically in the past. So this is stuff that you probably already very much know. So it's just fun in a very long kind of historical lens, just look at just largest cities by population. So we go back into 100 AD. You can sort of roughly look at the geographic variation. You see Europe, you see the Middle East, you see Asia, and then we just kind of quickly go through the time period. Again, Europe a little bit, Asia, the Middle East, go 500 more years, very much sort of Asia, the Middle East, and then you see, well, looks a little bit more new. You have a little bit more Europe, that's in there. Still Asia, the Middle East, and then you get to sort of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Now you see the US pop up, Europe pop up a little bit more. And then you go to 2005, and it now starts to look more like what we had much earlier. So maybe what we're seeing in the industrial was a little bit more of an outlier, and we could be going back to that era. So again, it's just fun to sort of imagine what are the largest cities in 2100, and what's sort of the underlying mechanism that created that variation that we saw. So again, just quickly running through the present and how we got here. And again, this is, I think, a lot of stuff that you already know. So if you see the progress of the past 100 years, we see human lifespan going up, per capita income going up, childhood mortality going down, cost of food going down, cost of electricity, cost of transportation, cost of communication that we're witnessing now. Oops, sorry, I went back. Press the space bar. No, I think just pop there, yeah. So again, it's interesting, you know, what was the underlying mechanism that drove a lot of this? We saw massive shifts in technology, massive migration to the cities, you know, massive creation of wealth, extreme levels of income inequality, extreme levels of political polarization. So it's funny, you know, we think about that as the Industrial Revolution. Actually, everything I said here actually represents the present. So again, we were going through this massive shift in technology, in the computing, internet. We saw again all the massive migration to cities. Again, income inequality, Gini coefficient, and stuff that you probably already know. We've exceeded what we had during the Gilded Age in the U.S. So again, that's definitely describes, I think, 2016, but also describes, like I said, the Industrial Revolution as well. So there is, I'm not sure, probably econ folks know who this is. So again, this person I think has more intellect on his pinky than I do. And he won the Nobel Prize in economics. This is Ron Coase. And he asked a very basic question, is like, why do we have organizations? Which again, back, you would have thought someone would answer that question before he really looked at it. And again, I think he gave a great answer. It was about, you know, sort of scaling efficiency. But I think to a certain degree he was a little bit of a prisoner of his own time. He was looking at the Industrial Revolution, the organizations that we needed to create to thrive in that world. So it was creating a widget faster, quicker, cheaper, and getting it out there. But you know, I think we are now coming into a different era, and I'm calling it a post-digital economy, post-digital society. So this is John Hagel, and he runs a center out on the West Coast from Deloitte called the Center for the Leading Edge. And he makes a really interesting argument. So he said where in the Industrial Revolution it was about scaling efficiency, he says in this era it's about scaling learning. So the organizations that can figure out how to learn faster, quicker are the ones that are going to do much better. And this is the shift that we're seeing. So these solutions that we have, they're not template solutions. Not you can come up with a process, implement it, and then people will sort of act like a widget. All of this stuff is changing so quickly. So you need, and we sort of hear this if you look at the business literature, literature about agile, creative teams and working in a sort of dynamic, flexible way. But John, I think, gives a really nice historical argument around this. So again, if this is a world that I know a little bit better, so can you look at kind of the technology ecosystem as the future, not just within the tech ecosystem, but more broadly. So if you look at this, for the ones that are old enough, back in the 80s, there was this big race around supercomputers. You know, who could actually, and this is teraflops per second. So again, the US led for a very, very long time, and then Japan, actually NEC with the Earth Simulator, was able to really trounce what HB was able to do. And there was a little bit of a kind of a scare in the US. Everyone sort of breathed a little bit of a sigh of relief when IBM came through, and they were able to squeak out and beat NEC by a little bit, so they went a little bit higher than 35 teraflops. But people sort of forgot, while all that was happening within these sort of big organizations that were competing with one another, there was this other thing called SETI at home, so I'm not sure if you remember. This is a little piece of software you could download that when your computer went into sort of sleep mode, this would kick in, and it would actually take your idle computing time and use it to analyze some of the pictures that was taken out in space. So while these big companies with all the resources, the smartest people on the planet, PhDs, developing and getting around 35 teraflops, there was this whole distributed people that are just spread out all over the world using their idle computing time, actually trouncing what these other companies were able to do. And so there's something about, again, open and sharing, and again, what we can do with the internet, with these tools, that was very difficult to do before. And this is, if you haven't read his work, Yochai Benkler, The Wealth of Networks, even though he's a lawyer, he's now at Harvard, I think he thinks more thoughtfully around the changes that are happening more on the economic side of things. And he has another more popular book called The Penguin versus the Leviathan, so representing Linux versus more of the sort of entrenched incumbent players. So what he talks about, he said when we were in the pre-internet age, there were these transactional frameworks that we had, and it really was within this four. And these were really the only three things that operated. So we had a market, we had decentralized, that was the price system that we have. We had a market centralized, more of a firm hierarchy. And then we had the non-market, and that's where, in a very centralized way, we had governments and nonprofits. But what then Yochai talks about is after, in the post-internet age, he says there is a whole new market that has now appeared. So the social sharing and exchange is a whole new mechanism that could potentially disrupt a lot of the stuff that we're seeing over here. And he gives actually a really nice example. So again, if you go a priori, you said, look, I'm going to give you a bunch of tech hobbyists scattered all over the world, and they're going to compete against the most powerful tech giant. Again, they have the highest amount of resources. They can recruit from MIT, Caltech, all the best universities. They can literally assemble the best people on the planet, pay them the best, give them free food, free lunch, and all of the stuff. Who is actually going to win? So in the pre-internet age, absolutely, I don't think the hobbyists would have a chance. But in the sort of post-internet world, it's interesting to see. So Apache is the web server, which is an open source. It's the software that's running a lot of the internet backend. And then Microsoft has Microsoft NT. So if you look at these two, so red is Microsoft, and the blue is Apache. So again, literally, you have a group of hobbyists, tech hobbyists, that are just giving their free time, and they are trouncing, again, at that time, this is back in 2001, one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. And this is actually something that I think has changed even when I first did my startup in 1999. For our initial cost to get the company up and running, we had to hire a sysadmin, we had to buy the database software, we had to get the computer. So just straight off the bat, it's $500,000 just to get the infrastructure. The T1 line we had to bring in, we had to pay a couple $1,000s every month just to get relatively high-speed internet. Fast forward to 2008 when I did my second startup, literally they call this the LAMP stack, so it stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, all open source, all free. And then you couple that with Amazon Web Services, where you only pay for the amount of computing power that you need or the storage that you need. So what cost us $500,000 in 1999, 2000 is now zero. You literally, if you have the skills, you can literally spin up a company. So again, if you think about all these new companies that are down here based on this, their cost is zero. The ability to scale, to be able to create distributed computing, parallel computing, it's all via Amazon Web Service. Again, this is something that has radically changed. And I think a great example of that, there's a great TED talk about this. So this Open ARV, this is a submersible that has cameras. So the guys that actually wanted to buy one of these, they realized it was incredibly expensive. And they said, why is it so expensive? So what they did was they used all the they used Google. They started researching the cost and what you need to do to build something like this. And then they started doing more research, and now because of the way that you can create startups, all of the aspects of creating a company, it literally has been, all the pieces have been sort of farmed out. So they were able to find a company that could then literally create all the pieces to it. They can create all of the distribution. Again, you can use Amazon to ship all the products, to do all the back-end handling. So they launched their own little company at a fraction of a cost to get these before. And then the cool thing is now, because they're all interconnected, you can now see where they are. They can talk to one another, and then they can feed back and also give you what's happening with the ocean. So again, gives that information and sharing. Again, this is something 5 years ago could cost $10, $20, $30 million to get it up. Again, they used all of the free resources to do it. So in the startup world, you hear this over and over again. I remember when I first got into the startup, they kept saying MVP, MVP. And I know basketball. I was thinking like sports, like what does the most valuable player have to do with anything with the startup? But the MVP in the startup world, and it's this sort of lean startup methodology. Eric Wright's the big champion of that. Steve Blank is a big champion of that. So MVP is minimum viable product. So when you're a startup, you have no resources. You have no real time, because time is an incredible essence. So within those constraints, how can you get at something and produce something that can give you some feedback, so you're not spending 6 months, a year of your time going up to some sort of dead end? How can you get and find out if it's a dead end in a week as opposed to a month or 3 months? So it literally is, you take an idea, you build an MVP, again, just getting at the core elements of what it needs to be, and then you go and test it. You get some customer feedback, and then you just keep going through this loop. And you will hopefully get better and better. So within the startup world, there's actually a nice template. So Steve Blank, he has his, I think it's the worst copy edited book in the world, called 4 Steps to Epiphany. I think Steve would probably agree with that. Now it's sort of changed, it's called Startup Canvas, but the basic idea is go do customer development before product development. So you may think it's a great idea, you may even have the resources to build it. He says, don't do it. Go talk to them, see is it really solving a pain point, build even a paper prototype and put it in front of them and get that feedback from them. So do the customer development before product development. And this is where Eric writes the lean startup. After you get that initial MVP, then build it and then keep testing it. And then there's a third component, which is Sean Ellis. I don't think people know him that well, but at the end of the day, when you're trying to build a startup and generate revenue, when should you start charging? So he has this very simple rule: is you can't start charging until literally you ask the customer this one question: is how disappointed would you be if you could no longer use this product? He said until you get to around 45%, don't even think, you don't have the product market fit. So in the startup world, again, I think there's very much a nice solid template for thinking about that. So in my role, when I got back into Columbia, I've been using this sort of MVP, so I've been changing the P. So whenever I think about something, and I think the sort of the initial reaction is, oh, can we get an MOU signed? Can we start doing? I really say, let's think about the minimum viable part. Like, what would it cost for us to just take the initial next step without having to sign a lot of these things? And then I also do it for minimum viable policy. What is, again, the core essence of what we need to do around this thing? So actually one of my colleagues at Columbia, he's been thinking, and it's interesting because he's coming from the School of the Arts, so he's taking a lot of the things that we know from the artistic community, So he's been incubating this thing, what I call kind of a social global design thinking and doing methodology. So if you think about how we've evolved as humans, and we all have this sort of visual of humans, kind of as an individual, and then slowly evolving to who we are, the Homo sapiens that we are, that's sort of a false visual. Because yes, on a certain degree, biologically, we may have evolved that way, but socially, we've never evolved that way, right? It was always a family, and then you got into a tribe, and then we build cities, city-states, nations, and we've always sort of evolved socially. So what Lance has been thinking about and doing is actually how can we take elements of the startup design thinking, what we learned in the creative process about being an active listener, an empathetic listener, and how can you create that to kind of prototype things in a really sort of meaningful way. So this is actually an example. We actually did this at Columbia, and we asked this question: is how can we take ideas into action? How can we take an institution like Columbia with all of the various pieces and turn ideas into action? So I think the initial reaction is like, why don't we have a conference? Why don't we invite people to speak? And then you said, I think the problem with that is you have, literally 5% of the people speaking 95% of the time. You're not really harnessing the collective wisdom. So what Lance has designed, which is really cool, and I'll lead you through the steps of what he did, was the first thing is you have this really fun check-in. I think we were actually thinking about doing it for this group, but it would take a little bit too much time. So literally, when people come in, there's no introductions. Literally, you pair up with someone you don't know, and you ask this question is, and usually this very simple thing is like, why are you here today? And you write it down. You can't respond to that, whatever they say. You just literally ask that same question again, why are you here today? And it really gets at a much deeper reason of why you're here. But the cool thing is it also builds this really cool relationship with the person that you are asking and doing this role playing with. So again, this is all, we do it a very, very analog way. And this is from an index card of why they were here today. And then after that, you lead them through this sort of Ignite talk. So instead of having someone talk a very long time, we have someone talk for maybe 5 minutes to really add the contextual framing of what they're there for. And then you have people literally just write down initial thoughts of when that person is speaking. So if I was actually doing this today, you would all have Post-its, and whatever I'm saying, you would just jot down these words that would be coming to you. And then after that, we have people then, and usually it's on sort of a right to left dimension. They go up, and it's pretty cool to see sort of visually what people's reaction was to these Ignite talks. And then after that, what we do is we have this World Cafe. So it's this really fun series of these 3 collaborative conversations, and coming up with those 3 questions is really important, but it really involves everyone, and everyone really gets to participate. So the way it's set up is everyone breaks up into around 6 people per table, and you have 1 designated documenter. So the first question is actually really getting people to think a little bit more on a personal, so with this sort of broader theme question, can you tap a question that will make it a little bit more personal for them? So for this one, for turning ideas into action, the question we asked them was, what global issues have moved you to action, and if so, why? And you just have the people talking about that, and people then writing down what it is. So you really have a nice conversation. Then what you do after that is everyone gets up. You pick, actually the person that was the documenter stays in, but everyone gets up and you mix. So for the second question, you're not actually talking to the same people again, you're talking to brand new people. And then now this gets people to focus a little bit more on the challenging part of that. So the question we asked here was, what are some of the challenges that organizations and universities face in transforming ideas into action in order to attack pressing global issues? So again, people have that conversation. You pick a new documenter that stays, and then people get up, and then you have a third question. This is to get to the MVP part. We want people to then focus on something very, very actionable. So again, it's taking the kind of the personal, the more the challenging, and then harnessing it into, what is some of the actionable things that we can do. So this one was, how might we harness the resources from the university to lead a collaborative group both within and outside of the university to transform ideas into sustainable action in order to solve our most pressing global issues. So again, you have that conversation. Again, it's with a new group of people. And then at the end, we have what's called a checkout. And we really we say, if there's one thing we can do when we leave this room, what would it be? And people would just write it down on an index card. So this actually takes around 2.5 hours. So again, you're crowdsourcing, and it's a really sort of collaborative way, and you're getting to sort of what we call an MVP, a minimum viable policy, a minimum viable action. So again, we took more of a non-traditional way, and I was a little hesitant with faculty members. It's sort of design thinking. When you say that to them, they're like, "What is this goofy thing?" But they really enjoy the process and really got a lot out of it. And we actually produced a little report, and happy to share it with the group if it will be useful afterwards. So again, I think we see all these buzzwords around entrepreneurship, innovation, startup, creativity, and it's not just, I think, in the tech startup world. It's being used within bigger organizations in a much more sort of fundamental way. I think this is just, I think a question I always throw out there, because I think there's such hype and optimism around innovation. But again, I think it's now being flipped where, fail fast, and it's being used in a positive way, and I can sort of understand that to a certain degree, because we want people to be less vulnerable about failing. But there is sort of the mechanism and process of failing. So the thing I always throw out there is, which city is the most innovative in tech startups? I think most people will say Silicon Valley, right? But you can actually flip that question and say, well, what city actually has the most failures in startups? It's Silicon Valley. Again, you say, what city is the most innovative in restaurants? You can say New York City. And flipping that question, it really is, New York actually generates the most failures. So there's this sort of interesting tension between having, on one level, of sort of a foundational element that allows that stability, but on top of that, allowing that failure to happen. And it's sort of these different levels of analysis that you want to look at. And this is just more coming at it for, I think there's a bunch of books in the startup world, but this is Stuart Firestein, he's a biologist, so he looks at, in the field of science, the role that failure actually has played in innovations in science. And this is actually, it's work by Henry Timms. I'm not sure if you know Henry. He's actually right over here. So he's the director of the 92nd Street Y. He's been there for a few years. And he talks about also this sort of fundamental shift, sort of what along the lines of Hegel. So he says in the old world, organizations were set up like Tetris. You're a block, you're this, you're specialist in this, and we're going to kind of move those pieces together, and we're going to fit this sort of nice way. He said, those days are over. We really are what he calls in sort of the Minecraft world. So anyone that has kind of young kids, your kids are playing Minecraft, and like, what are they doing? It really is this incredible social, they really are working together with kids all over to build these sort of interesting projects. So what Henry talks about in his colleagues is sort of old power versus new power, and he has this nice HBR article on it. Again, happy to share all of this stuff with you, and knock on wood, I think he's going to turn that into a book. But he talks about, again, if you look at sort of the participation scale, kind of old power versus new power, sort of kind of traditional consuming type, there's sharing, shaping, funding, producing, and this whole notion of co-owning. There's some other stuff that I'm doing around what I'm calling sort of co-op capitalism that I could talk about more in the Q&A. But again, we think about these sort of scales of participation that's always been there, but I think there are things that are happening now in what, again, in the sort of post-internet transaction world, where we can get into some of the co-owning. And it's pretty funny, he actually maps out kind of old power values versus new power values. So again, old power is about managerialism, institutionalism, representative governance. In the new power, it's about informal, opting in, decision-making, self-organizing, network governance. Again, old power being exclusive, competition, authority, resource consolidation. Again, in the new, it's about open source, collaboration, crowd wisdom sharing. Again, discretion, confidentiality, separation, radical transparency. Again, professional specialization, do it ourselves, the maker culture, and then long-term affiliation and loyalty, versus sort of short-term conditional affiliation. So he's trying to separate out between these two. And then it's funny, he sort of maps companies onto these sort of old versus new power models, and he talks about castles. They want to create this sort of moat, connectors, crowds, and sort of cheerleaders, and maps companies on this dimension. So it's funny to see, it's interesting to see how some of it's mapped out on some of these new power values, but within sort of cheerleader and crowds versus old power values and sort of these models. So again, it's a really fun little read, and I would definitely recommend it. So again, it's interesting if you think about platforms. We always think about internet, I think, as a platform. But again, I think it's interesting to think about just different scales. We can think about society as a platform. We can think about, yes, we have an operating system for a computer, but this is democracy or certain rules that we have. Is that an operating system for society, and what does platform for society look like? Again, city as a potential platform. Again, that's where I was talking about kind of Silicon Valley. So again, I think Silicon Valley, they have that ecosystem, that platform that's set up that allows all this dynamism to happen. But again, there's this very much solid, the VC community, the lawyers that are there, the entrepreneurs. It's very much a dynamic system. But again, it's very much, I think, a platform as well. And then again, you think of organization, think about the UN, think about Columbia. All these are different types of platforms. And it's, I think, on the one hand, there's, I think, very positive things. Again, we talk about you should be open, you should embrace potentially new power versus old power. But there are all these, I think these are very much opposite ends of the same coin. So yes, you can be open, but if you want openness, there's a dynamism that's going to happen. So if you're managing, controlling people, and you want to say, I want to have an open XYZ, you have to get used to a very dynamic type of culture that's going to happen. It's the same thing with, I think, creativity. Actually, I didn't show the slide, but there's this whole notion of, yes, we want more creativity, we want more innovation, but I always talk about these terms as sort of prospective versus retrospective terms. So innovation is a classic retrospective term. When people are actually in the moment of being innovative, there is no consensus that person is being innovative, right? It's after the fact, you're successful, wow, you were so innovative. So there is a notion of, yes, we want creativity. When there isn't consensus of who is creative, there's this whole, again, I think people know, even when, ask people to sit in the front of the room, there's some vulnerability aspects. So I think if you're managing folks and you want people to be creative, the opposite side of that is, really being able to understand aspects of vulnerability and hopefully being able to understand that process as well. Again, innovation, this whole notion of failure, which I talked about. Collaboration. Again, I think we want collaboration. Again, if we can collaborate more, it's better. But again, there's this notion of, I think, empathy. And it takes time to build empathy and having that sharing as well. And this is actually really interesting, and this is where sort of design thinking comes in. And it's this sort of notion of you need, cross-function folks. You need people that can go across organizations. And it's so funny because when you talk to a lot of organizations and they want cross-collaboration, I want people to break out of silos, and you look at the org chart, you say, who actually is tasked to go across the organization, like me, the CEO? And there was an article they were talking about Amazon. There's one other person that literally knows what's happening across all the divisions. So we want, silos to be broken down. We want sideways thinking. We know the positive aspects of it, but hardly anyone is tasked to do that. And what does that even look like within an organization? Who do you end up potentially reporting to? What are the values of that? So these are, I think, some interesting questions to think about. Again, I think having a community is incredibly important. And again, there's a couple of things with all this technology that we have that there are no shortcuts to. So we can't create an extra hour in a day with all the technology that we have. Yes, we can maybe be more productive within that time. But I think there's really no shortcut to building trust. Again, we can have all the technology and we can communicate with people more, but it just takes time to build trust and to build that community. So again, it's then interesting to think about with all the stuff that we know, where we're entering now with the post-digital economy, this post-internet transaction world, you know, yeah, what will the UN look like in 2027, 2057, 2127, 2117 with all the stuff that's happening? And that's the question I sort of throw out to you for that.